Hi, thank you so much for clicking on our webinar series. This is our sixth webinar of the series, and it's a series that looks to answer the key questions that are in your head by connecting you with thought leaders. In this episode, we explore all things culture, how to build, adapt and grow an organisational culture, how to challenge it as well as develop it. Hope you enjoy.
So, culture, what is it? And is it really as important as people think? I think so. So in today's rapidly changing world, culture within an organisation can often be the difference, I think, between success and failure. As leaders, we all hold a unique position, not only to set the tone of an organisational culture, but also sustaining it and nurturing it through periods of growth and change. Most of us on this call operate within the world of change. I think everyone operates within the world of change, whether they know it or not. And our values, behaviours and decisions can ripple throughout an organisation, whether knowingly or unknowingly, shaping experiences, attitudes of our teams. Often culture is seen as something that's intangible, but it's immeasurable, the thing that doesn't give you a clear ROI. It feels now, though, more than ever, there is a real need to unite cultures, bringing people together in the UK. So to explore this today, joining us is Becky Strafford, organisational psychologist and human-centric change consultant. Becky, it'd be great if you could share a little bit more about who you are and your journey through change.
Thanks, George. So yes, as George mentioned, my name is Becky Strafford. I work for a human-centric change consultancy. That's a bit of a mouthful. But I've been working in the field of change management for over 20 years, across all sectors, private, third and public sectors. I also hold a master's in organisational psychology, and that's really where my true passion lies, in workplace behaviour, in culture change, and really helping organisations create healthy, positive cultures that help both people and the business themselves thrive. And I think, like you say, George, that right now is probably one of the most important things that we've got going on.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. So I guess my sort of opening question to you, Becky, is there are so many different fields of change, aren't there? You know, I'm sure we've got digital transformation experts on the call, office moves, sustainability. There's so many variations of change out there. What sort of inspired you to focus on culture and specifically change within your career?
So the culture side, I think, is really more about, for me, workplace behaviour, employee behaviour. And that stems from all the way back to when I was a teenager. And I really was quite obsessed with everything to do with why people react and behave the way that they do, so much that I literally had every single magazine of true crime. I don't know if anyone's of my generation and remember, and I know true crime podcasts are really a big thing now, but back then it was all about this magazine that was called True Crime, and you could get the binders and you could shove all of the magazines into the binders, and I literally had every single magazine, every single binder, and I was obsessed. And whilst that was all about kind of criminals and crime and why people did those horrible things that unfortunately we still see even today, what was underlying that was actually why people did what they did, and that was to an extreme point of view. But at the age of 20, I did a year's work placement as part of my degree, and unfortunately was subjected to harassment and bullying by two of the company directors. And that was my very first taste, right, my very first job, of a toxic culture. And that was what sparked my interest in culture and changing culture and creating environments and workplaces that were actually really supportive and psychologically safe, which is a term we now know, but we didn't necessarily know of that back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, agree. So much. And so I guess what role does an organisational culture play in the success or failure of a change initiative then?
So I think predominantly it's all about if we don't have a culture that is truly supportive of creating an adaptable environment, then I don't necessarily think that we can truly change. And I think if people are too attached to current ways of working, too attached to their existing systems or tools, or they're in an environment where there's little trust or poor leadership, then it's actually harder to make any kind of change. On the flip side, if we've got open communication, we involve our employees, we've got a growth mindset, we're resilient, and we can embrace progress, then these are all good omens that change will go much more smoothly. So ultimately, organisations that have got an agile and healthy culture are best positioned to handle the change.
Nice. And so I guess reflecting back, often culture can be very sort of intangible things. So from your experiences, what are the key elements that sort of shape an organisation's culture?
Oh my goodness, the key ones rather than all of them. So I think there are loads that people would probably expect me to roll off. Employee behaviour and attitudes, policies and practices, because they ultimately are the way that we interact with each other. They shape our expectations of how we work. But I think for me, some of the ones that are least unexpected. So industry norms is a good one to probably call out. So if we just think about the difference between a startup and a global bank, and imagine the cultures that you would automatically expect, they are the cultures that you will see across organisations within those industries. And it's understanding what they are and understanding whether they're the right culture for that particular industry, or whether there is actually an element of, do we need to shift and change? I think other things are very much around our leadership style and our leadership behaviour, and I don't think we can not call that out. And I think I'd bring that to life a little bit. I recently did some consultancy work where an organisation was partway through a cultural shift following a review of that highlighted harassment and bullying. Their vision was a more inclusive, a more trusting organisation with a flatter and more agile way of working, but the leaders still made all the decisions, and that stopped the organisation from making the progress and the change they needed. So it's actually, what is that leadership style? And that's a real key element for me. I think one that's particularly pertinent at the moment is our work environment, our physical space. How our office is laid out, how they're designed, the amenities, that all influences how we interact and work together. An open office space encourages collaboration, closed-in spaces foster more focus and individual work, but also the general atmosphere of a workplace, the noise levels, our lighting, the vibe, it all contributes to the cultural experience of our employees.
Someone once said to me, this a number of years ago, particularly around that sort of startup moving to a scale up sort of mentality, that when you're a founder and you are the founder of the business, it is ultimately a business of one. Like, you are the culture, and then as you grow that business, you bring on board another employee, your culture is just half. Like, you are half of the culture now. And so I think that's a really interesting one about how do you startup culture. I think it's quite easy, it's quite clear, this is who we are and this is how we are, because we're a really small group of people. But when you're scaling up, you're an enterprise organization, you've got over 1,000 employees plus, operating across various sort of countries. How is culture something that has to be actively managed, or is it just a byproduct of how you operate?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think organisations that leave, and I can instantly think of an organisation right now that have left it. Unfortunately, I can't tell you who they are because I'm currently working with them. They have left it, and they've left it as we're just going to let it go. It is what it is. And ultimately, what's happening is people, there aren't necessarily, and I don't like necessarily using the word boundaries, but there's no dotted line that is kind of like there, sort of saying, these are how we expect people to behave. These are our values. This is what we're striving to achieve. This is ultimately what's loosely right or wrong. And because of that, there are pockets of toxicity where certain individuals are pushing those unsaid boundaries and are creating environments of work that aren't safe, they aren't nice to be in, and as a result we've got issues of mental health or well-being. And I think that when you actually have a focus on maintaining a culture, when you have a focus on actually making sure that it's a safe environment, what whatever that it means, whether you are looking at creating a more agile way, a more structured way of working, a more flexible way of working, more adaptable, more resilient, whether you've got more innovation or creativity as your goals. If you've got a focus on that and you have everybody in on that journey, then it's everyone's responsibility to actually shape culture. It doesn't fall down to one department or one individual. It actually then is everyone takes accountability and responsibility for actually driving and shaping the culture of that organisation. And I think that's what's important.
Nice. I couldn't agree more. I've got two questions. I've got a two-part question for you, Becky.
Okay.
So most people on this call will be sort of senior leaders within their organisation. My first part of the question is, as a senior leader, how can I really identify what my culture is, and how can I take personal responsibility of proactively growing, developing, enhancing that culture?
Yeah, so I think the first question on how do you know or how do you see what your culture is really interesting, an interesting one. And so we look at, typically when we're looking at culture, we look at those key things. So one of the big ones that that we called out earlier. So what are our styles? What are our core values? What's our mission? What we're trying to achieve? What are our behaviours? So ultimately, in a big organisation, you've already got those things mapped out. But it's the nuances, the things that are unsaid. It's our organisation stories, our achievements, our key figures. They're really powerful tools for transmitting cultures. Our logo, our slogans, our dress code, our decor, how we expect people to show up, our identity. It's as well as those rituals and traditions, those annual events, those social gatherings, which build a sense of community and reinforce that identity. How you recognise and celebrate achievements can also reinforce that as well. So it's identifying all the things that are said and unsaid. But there are also really powerful, there's also really powerful things that you can use. There's tools and diagnostic tools out there that will actually help you identify what your behaviour is if you're not entirely sure. And I think that's really core, is actually like, once you've understood what your current behaviour is, what your current culture is, it is then identifying whether there are things there that actually you don't want to hang on to anymore, whether they're not actually serving the organisation and driving it forward. And then it's identifying what that new behaviour or new culture looks like. And in that is actually then it's not something that you can do alone. I think it's then very much a case of how do you involve the organisation, how do you involve everybody in a certain way to actually try and shape that, so it's an environment that everybody feels part of. And there's two parts to that. First is very much around, if we involve them, they're more likely to join in on the journey. That's a key change, baseline piece of information. If you're involved, you're more likely to be part of the journey. The second is we're creating a culture that we want everybody to be part of. And if they input into it, then it is going to be part of them. And so they have a sense of belonging right from the outset. And that with culture is massively important. I might have to ask you to ask me the second question again, because I can't remember if I've answered all of it.
No, I haven't even asked it yet. So
yeah, that's fine. Okay, good.
It'd be good if you had. So the second part of that question for me is, not everyone is in the leadership position, but they're really passionate about the organisation. They've got an idea. They're the people who live and breathe that culture. And someone once said to me as well, a standard that you walk past is a standard that you accept. So I guess in that vein, I am the employee of a big enterprise company, and I see something that doesn't align to what I think is our organizational culture. How can I address that? How can I try and make that change? How do I raise that with people?
That's a really, really interesting question. And before I answer it, I just want to call out an example. There's an ambulance service. I'm not going to necessarily call out which one, because I think this could apply to many ambulance services across our country at the moment. And there's all sorts of, in this particular ambulance service, there's an element of sexual harassment that's going on. And it's been called out in the newspapers. And what's happened is that it's happening in front of colleagues, but colleagues don't have that sense of safety to be able to call it out. And so they're witnessing behaviour that isn't appropriate, and they don't feel safe. They don't, because of the consequence of the fear of what actually might happen to them as a result of calling it out. And I've highlighted that particularly because if you don't have a psychologically safe environment, you can't expect colleagues to call anything out, because of the fear of consequence on what might happen to them. And unfortunately, it's human nature to protect yourself first. It is absolutely in our DNA. It takes quite a lot to break past that barrier of turning around and saying, I'm actually going to put somebody else before my own because of fear of what might happen. And it takes a lot. And so unless we can create an environment and a culture of psychological safety where we actually provide and create safe channels to call out behaviour that is not warranted, then it unfortunately won't happen. Now, we can put all of the different plans in place. We can put in whistleblowing things. We can say call out to HR. We can say, call it out to your line manager. But again, if there's not a safe environment, then it won't happen. Now, on the opposite end of the scale, actually what should happen is that we should all take the responsibility that if we see something that we feel that we can and do say something about that. And that's something as simple as, having a really calm and detailed conversation with the individual if it's appropriate. It's about providing leaning in on if it's a behaviour that's impacting somebody else, it's talking to the individual that might be impacted. It's about having open and honest conversations with our line managers, with HR, but actually what comes down to it is transparency, open and honest conversations. And unless you can have that, then unfortunately there's an instant problem that we've got at cultural level.
Yeah, it's a tough one to navigate, isn't it?
Really tough one. Yeah.
And I think again, it probably comes back round to the role of the leader as well to try and facilitate that safe space, create the right forums for that to
absolutely. It's also about leadership role modelling the right behaviours as well, though. And I think what's really important here is that they set the tone, they provide the direction, they model the behaviours that are going to shape and reinforce a desired culture, a desired set of behaviours. And if they're not doing that, then ultimately what happens is we typically mimic those that are in a leadership role, because they're the people that the organisation look to. They are the people that inspire and motivate. They are the ones that are most active. And so if they are just demonstrating behaviour that's not quite right, then we will often see that replicated in the layers beneath.
Yeah, 100%. And I've got one more question I was really keen to ask you before I sort of open it up to the group. So everyone, if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat, and I'll ask it of Becky. My question though is, historically there's been a narrative. There's been a narrative around change and cultural change in particular being quite fluffy, not really giving you the ROI that let's say a digital transformation would. How can we overcome that challenge? How can we make cultural change more measurable, be able to demonstrate an ROI?
So I think it's a really interesting one, and I have called out in the past that I work on the fluffy side of change. I don't do that anymore because I don't believe it is fluffy, because actually what we have started to see is that there are some real benefits to a positive and healthy culture in an organisation. Mental health and wellbeing is quite an obvious one, performance and productivity, but actually it also has an impact on our revenue, because if we have our employees who are happy and healthy and they're more productive, they're more engaged, they are likely to stay with an organisation longer, and that ultimately leads to a higher turnover if you're private, or maybe not necessarily profitability in some of the sectors, but it absolutely adds it. And I think what's really important is making sure that we have clear KPIs on what we actually want our culture to do and the impact of it. And I think there are some elements of that. And I've actually just going to quickly scroll through, because I made a note earlier around, and I did this because I was doing it for another organisation, and I wanted to just call it out. Here we go. So if one of your culture change goals is to develop a greater enthusiasm for innovation, because ultimately what we should have is goals for our culture, any kind of change program, whether it's digital transformation or culture, right? So if you've got a goal that is greater enthusiasm for innovation in the company by the end of the year, what's really important is to have KPIs, and our KPIs could be something like a 5% increase in revenue generated from innovation. It could be a 10% increase in the use of companies' idea submission board, or a 10% increase in the number of actionable project ideas submitted by employees. And I think that's what's really important, is to have those kind of KPIs, and they can be tangible KPIs when you're linked to to culture change. They don't have to be, we've got more people engaged, and employee engagement is becoming a bit of a loose term. So I think it's about actually looking a bit deeper. But there are other things that you can look at as well, which will really help from that metric side of things. A lot of, it's interesting because I saw a job advert earlier that said, please don't look at Glassdoor, basically, because we don't actually, I can't think what the word is that they use, but they basically don't monitor the Glassdoor things. They can't actually say whether they're true or not, which I found really interesting, because the whole purpose of Glassdoor is to be open and transparent about an individual's opinions and thoughts, and it's how we then turn it. But last year I actually worked with a company, and we actually did actively track company ratings on comments on Glassdoor over a 12-month period. We also looked at employees' comments on LinkedIn, and we weren't doing it from a big brother point of way, but to really look at how they were thinking and feeling. And that really helped us understand how culture change was progressing and how employees really perceived the organisation and its culture. And it's these things that can really help us. And to change it from something that's fluffy to actually something that's really tangible and helping the organisation move forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think there are a lot of those those sort of indirect ways of understanding culture. It leads me quite nicely on to a question that's come from Paul. I'd be curious to know about some of the diagnostics that Becky would recommend for identifying culture. Kind of touched on a few there. Are there any others that you typically use?
So there are two ones that are actually kind of data driven and like actual pieces of software. One is called the organisational culture assessment instrument, and the other is called the organisational culture inventory. That you can, if you Google those, and I'm happy to share, they're nothing to do with me. So they're not my product. They are products that are out there owned by other organisations. But what they actually do, and a lot of it is, it's just measuring where you might be on a scale. So it's identifying what are the things within your culture that you want to assess. And then it's measuring where you are on a scale. And ultimately, what you typically would have to do is you'd look at a focus group or groups of people across your organisation. Everybody would put into an input there as you take an average. And then you would turn out and say, well, actually, what do we want? Where do we want to be? What's our desired? And that then is almost like your change impact assessment. It's where you are now, it's where you want to be. And then you can start looking at your roadmap about how you're actually going to move on that journey.
Nice, and that's the way I guess you can build that project around that and monitor it as you do change.
Absolutely, and the thing with the culture change program is that I think historically a lot of people have just said, right, we need to go on a culture change, and they're just kind of like, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this. But it should be approached as any transformation program should be. What's the business? Start with your business case, create your plan, create your strategy, complete everything. It's a transformation program at the end of the day. And we shouldn't be approaching it in any other form.
Nice, as Simon Sinek would say, start with the why.
Start with the why.
Nice. I've got a question from Dave, and I think it's a really interesting one. So, how do you reconcile the difference between the latest generation's expectation of culture against their own belief systems and the practical reality of the needs of the organisation?
That's a really great. And I think it's really interesting because I think some of our generations that are coming in, our Gen Z, Gen A generations, they very much are very purpose-led. They want a real hybrid way of working. They want to know that they're making a difference. We see so much research that says purpose before profit and all these kind of things. And how does that then fit? And I think one of the big challenges we've got in organisations now is we've got potentially 4 or 5 generations in the workplace, because we've got people retiring later, people starting with apprenticeships younger. So actually we've got people from as young as the age of 16 going all the way up into their 60s working in one organisation. And we know that the beliefs of somebody in their 60s is very different to somebody in their late teens and early 20s. So trying to create a culture where everybody feels great and is actually driving forward is actually really quite challenging, and more so than it's ever been today. And I think what's ultimately important is that whilst, especially in global organisations, what we have to think about is that there is a culture is a boundary. It's not a strict way of doing things. It's not this is our list. Everybody has to do this, but culture has to be inclusive. So everyone has to feel safe. They can actually be themselves at work. And I think when we start thinking about culture as in creating an environment where everyone can feel and be themselves with a framework or boundary around that, and it's going to be really difficult for me to talk about this without wanting to bore, then that's when it becomes challenging. Could you just please repeat the question for me to make sure that I'm actually answering it and I'm not going off on a tangent, which does.
No, I think you're doing very well. How do you reconcile the difference between the latest generation expectation of the culture against their own belief systems and the practical reality of the needs of the organisation? How does the needs of the organisation differ against those individuals?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that it should ever differ, because as culture should always be inclusive and everyone should be part of the conversation around culture. I think the bigger challenge will actually be how you create a culture where you have got 5 generations that are easily working together. And I think one of the big things that we are seeing is this, the number of reviews and reports that we're seeing around harassment, toxicity, bullying, is because organizations in the 70s and 80s there were things that were accepted that aren't accepted anymore, and there are people still working in those same ways that aren't prepared to shift their way of working. And I think we are going to have to hold ourselves accountable to say, is that right? Just because it was okay 20 years ago, 30 years ago, does it make it right now? And I think that's the bigger question for me there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We sort of touched upon sort of startup companies earlier on. When I reflect on some of those sort of big startup companies, those companies who were founded fairly recently but have grown really quickly, to me there seems to be quite a different type of organization. So we take Gymshark as an example. For those of you who know me, I'm not really a big gym person or an exercise person, but I'm fascinated by that journey. And my reflection is that the business seems to create community. It's a community business that just so happens to make profit. They're serving. There's an underlying serving of that community, which then creates the culture of an organization. So I think it's fascinating. And I guess to sort of coming to your question, Paul, the world is changing. The world is getting ever more complex, ever more interconnected. We've got climate change, we've got AI coming down the track, supercomputing. Like you say, Becky, changes the way in which the makeup of the workforce. Paul's question is specifically around AI. How do you think AI will impact a company's culture, and will it be positive or will it be negative?
Yeah, it's a really good thing. So I think that AI is probably one of the biggest things that's going to hit change and transformation this year in the next 5 years. And I think it's going to be multifaceted when it comes to culture. But I think one of the most significant impacts will be on innovation, because I think what we've got is AI-powered systems that are going to be able to analyze vast amounts of data. They're going to identify patterns, and they're going to be able to identify patterns in human behavior and how we're reacting to things. They're going to be able to generate insights into information that we've not been able to access before. And that is going to be able to help us make real critical data-driven decisions and help us make maybe more calculated risk. I think it's also going to help us with experimentation and creativity by providing us with tools to test and refine ideas more quickly. But I think one of the biggest issues with AI is going to be around the ethical side of things, particularly around privacy, bias, decision-making, transparency. And so I think organizations are going to need to address those issues in order to make sure they're building and maintaining trust when they're introducing AI. But I think the most exciting thing for me around AI is that it's going to provide access to information and data in such a quicker way, which will then help us make quicker decisions and help shape and improve things so much faster.
Yeah. It's definitely going to make a big change, isn't it? Definitely going to make a big change. Brill, I think we've probably got time for one more question. So I don't know if anyone wants to be quick on the keyboards to put the last question in. If not, I certainly got loads that I could ask.
I was going to say, whilst we're just waiting for that, I might just want to, just what you were saying about Gymshark and going back to that, because something that's just popped into my head around the cross-generation thing. I think one thing that will really tie generations together is that sense of belonging and that sense of purpose. So I did a big piece of work to save the children earlier on this year. And one of the big things was around creating a sense of purpose and making sure that everybody was focused on that. So we had this red thread going all the way through the organisation, and everyone had hold of this red thread. They were all connected to it. And that red thread went all the way to the children out all over the world that they were having an impact on and helping. And that then gave them individual sense of purpose. And it didn't matter what generation that they were, that they had that purpose. And that created this sense of community, to your point, Jim Sharp, created that sense of community and that sense of belonging. And I think that's probably quite critical when we've got more generations in an organisation. Sorry, I just need to throw that.
I think it's great. It's such an interesting example, isn't it? Really, John, you've got your hand up, sir.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with one, George. I think Becky, you partly answered this one already. Actually, my question was really around how you kind of position and brand a culture change program, because I've certainly been through several culture change initiatives which are explicitly branded as culture change. Is that the right thing to do, or should you be focusing on specific outcomes rather than calling it a culture change program, or does it not matter?
I think it is down to in the individual organisation's approach to it. And I'm going to touch on Save the Children again, because when I went into Save the Children, I called it a culture change program and got told off because it wasn't a culture change program. It was completely looking at, it was touching more than just culture. It was talking about how they worked. It was going to touch on systems and structures and everything. And so actually calling it just culture was doing it an injustice. And so I think it's ultimately looking at it from a more outcome focused way is always great, because ultimately what you're then doing is you're right from the outset, you're letting people know what the benefits are going to be, what that thing is going to be that's going to make a difference to them. And if we can get them brought in, the sooner the better. That has just a natural snowball effect on the success of any kind of change. And so whether or not we call it a culture change program, I think also depends on what has historically gone down in organisations before. I've worked in organisations that have tried and failed to try and change culture. And so when they roll out the term culture change again, they instantly get this fear amongst individuals and groups of people within the organisation to go, oh my God, here we go again, or we're going to do this, or we're just going to make a load of people redundant, or, oh, it's just not going to work because it didn't work last time. So yes, it can be called a culture change program, but I think there are so many things that you potentially have to think about before you name it anything. And I think that it will depend on the individual organisation, depending on the historic and future perspective.
Real.
I hope that's
exciting stuff. Yeah, so I think we'll try and wrap it up there. Give some time back in your diaries. I'm sure it's a welcome thing. Becky, I want to say a huge thank you for joining us today, sharing your knowledge, expertise, and insights. It's been really, really valuable. I've certainly learned a huge amount. If people want to stay tuned on your change journey, how can they do so?
The best way is to find me on LinkedIn. It's really easy, Becky Strafford. I don't have anything else that you need to look for, so you can just search for me that way, or you can come find me via my website, which is px2, that's P for Papa, X for X-ray number 2.uk. You can see all about us there as well. But LinkedIn is probably the best way. And I've got so much that I can talk about this on this subject that I might actually do a bit of a LinkedIn series on articles. So if you want to connect with me and find out a bit more, I might do a few weeks worth of articles for you to kind of stay on that culture change journey.
Brilliant. Sounds good. I'm really excited to share our next potential webinar. So I've long been a fan of a former Olympic athlete, Fatima Whitbread. I met Fatima about a year or so ago as she was campaigning for Action for Children. So fingers crossed, in September, she's going to be joining us for our next webinar to discuss her experiences of campaigning for change. Date yet to be confirmed, but when it is, I will share it with you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great weekend once it arrives.
Thank you so much for watching our webinar. We hope you've enjoyed it. As I mentioned at the start, this is a series that is about you, connecting you with thought leaders to answer the key questions that are in your head. So I'd love if you could share those key questions. Let me know, and we'll be able to bring the best thought leaders to the table.